Okay.
Now people are jumping on. We'll give it just a couple minutes here and we'll get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Harmony webinar series. My name is Christy Weeks, and I am the Digital Media Manager for Harmony. We thank you for joining us today, and I hope all of you and your families are all well and safe as we roll into the summer. Today's presentation is the overview of crisis services, levels of care, and M-1 EC holds, and it is being presented by 3 individuals from Summit Stone Health Partners in Colorado, Sunny Pickowitz, Julie Costre, and Rachel Odom. So I'm going to roll through a few things here about Harmony. We are nestled up on a 43-acre campus in the Rocky Mountains just outside of Estes Park. We offer a comprehensive treatment for adults and their family members, and we have been in Colorado and in business for over 50 years. We believe that long-term recovery from alcohol and other drugs is possible. Our staff at all levels of the organization work together to create a community of recovery support. We are a 70-bed residential treatment program, and we have just recently added a virtual IOP program. We offer an evidence-based 12-step program that is gender responsive. And if you'd like to learn more about Harmony, we invite you to visit us at www.harmonyfoundationinc.com, or you can contact our admissions staff at 866-686-7867. We do have several policies in place at this point that is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As with everybody, those requirements and steps are fluctuating. So if you would like to see our latest precautions that we have in place, please visit our website. They are listed there. Or if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our Chief Marketing Officer, Gina Thorne. She is at gthorne@harmonyfoundationinc.com. Just a few things as we move through the presentation today. We want you to keep in mind is that you will be receiving an email within an hour after the presentation with an evaluation. Please take the time to do that. We love your feedback. We like to know what we're doing right and what we could improve on. And we also would really appreciate your input as to future topics you would like us to cover. So in regards to the CEU, you must be actively engaged in this presentation for at least 45 minutes in order to receive a certificate. We do use a system that tracks how long you are engaged in the program, so anything less than 45 minutes would not qualify. However, we can provide an attendance certificate if for some reason you do need to jump off early. You will receive your certificate by the end of day on Friday, June 26th. Please give me a little bit of time to get everything pulled together and make sure we're sending out correct certificates. So if you do not respond or receive a certificate by that time, please feel free to reach out to me. You can get me at cweeks@harmonyfoundationinc.com. One more thing I want to remind you is that we do record these webinars, and you will be able to find it and all of our other past webinars on our website under the professional tab in archived webinars. We will be answering questions at the end of this presentation. So please, as they come across, feel free to send them into the chat box. We will kind of field them as they come and present them to our presenters at the end. And then that way we will be sure to address as many of them as we can. So that all being said, we want to thank Summit Stone for their partnership with us. And if you are interested in learning more about them, please head to their website, www.summitstonehealth.org. Again, they are located in Colorado. And our presenters today, I'm so happy to have all three of them with us. We do have Sunny Pickowitz, Julie Costry, and Rochelle, I apologize, Rochelle Odom. Their bios are all here. I have a feeling they're going to do a quick intro on their own, so I don't want to take up all the time reading the slide, but I'm really, really excited to have them. So I am actually going to turn it over to our presenters. Here we go.
Thank you, Christy, for that warm welcome. I'm going to share my screen here. And get this going so you can all see. There we go. So my name is Sunny Pickowitz. I'm the program manager for our crisis services here at Summit Stone. I took this role on, it's been over a year now. I started May of last year, and it's been a great year with Summit Stone and at Crisis. I've really enjoyed getting to know Larimer County and the services we offer, and I've really enjoyed working with the team here at Crisis. We've experienced a lot of change and growth over the past year, and so we're very excited to be here today to share a little bit about our services, what we do for our communities, and a little bit of what levels of care look like and hold. So we're excited to share that with you today. Just a brief look at our objectives. We are going to cover quite a bit of material in a short amount of time. So like she said, if you have questions, we want to allow some time for that at the end because we do have quite a bit of information we want to share. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of an overview of crisis services. So to start with, one definition that we're going to use today for crisis, we're taking from Gerald Kaplan, often referred to as the father of modern crisis intervention. He's described crisis as an obstacle that is for a time insurmountable by the use of customary methods of problem solving. A period of disorganization ensues, a period of upset, during which many abortive attempts at a solution are made. So in its simplest form, according to Kaplan, it is an upset in the steady state of an individual. In a crisis, individuals are confronted with problems that often cannot be solved, at least in that moment or on their own. And these issues can result in an increase in tension, anxiety, emotional unrest, and or a compromised ability to function. So in other words, an event or obstacle that directly impacts an individual's ability to function. So just further, it can define crisis as events or situations perceived as intolerably difficult that exceeds an individual's available resources and coping mechanisms. So why is it important to normalize crises? A mental health crisis is just as important to address as any health crises, such as a heart attack, broken bone, stroke, etc., and should be given the same care and attention as any other health crises would. The word crisis often conjures images of panic, emergency, and feelings of being out of control. And sometimes this can be true in cases of natural disasters, such as bombing, shootings, personal attacks, etc. However, at other times, crisis may be viewed as a normal part of life. Crisis can occur in the lives of normal, average individuals who are just having difficulty coping with stress, and therefore they represent a state to which most of us can relate. I'm sure we've all experienced some level of crisis at some point in our lives. The Chinese translation of the word crisis contains two characters, which can mean danger and opportunity. And accordingly, crisis intervention thus provides opportunities for clients to learn new coping skills while identifying and enhancing those skills that they already possess. So when we're thinking about crises, thought it might be helpful to break it down into 4 parts. The first being that a precipitating event occurs and a person has a perception of the event as threatening or damaging. The perception of those events is by far the most crucial part to identify, and it can be most easily and quickly altered by the crisis counselor. The focus on perception differentiates crisis intervention from most other forms of counseling, in that it is brief and focused more on present circumstances at hand. And additionally, unlike other forms of counseling, a more active stance is taken on the part of the crisis counselor to ensure safety and to ensure clients reassert control over his or her immediate situation. So again, back to that perception can lead to emotional distress, and that emotional distress can lead to impairment in functioning due to failure of an individual's usual coping methods that previously have prevented a crisis from occurring. So just a little bit about characteristics and types of different crises. Characteristics can include that the event precipitating the crisis is perceived as threatening, that there's an apparent inability to modify or reduce the impact of the stressful events, that there is an increased fear, tension, and or confusion, that there is a high level of subjective discomfort, and a state of disequilibrium is followed by a rapid transition to an active state of crisis. Different types of crises would be accidental and developmental. Accidental could include traumatic events or life hazards, which may occur at any time, such as an earthquake or sudden death, maybe a job loss, new health diagnosis, etc. Developmental crises could be more along the lines that occur at any point in development, such as birth, onset of puberty, adolescence, relationship, partnership, aging concerns, that type of thing. Some examples of crisis: suicidal or homicidal ideations, mood issues, uncontrolled symptoms of mental illness, any relapse for substance use, financial stressors, unemployment, death of a loved one, illnesses, as I mentioned before, divorce, family conflict, other health issues, etc. Crisis events can also be self-defined, and that the crisis is determined by the individual experiencing it. For all of the clients that we serve here at Summit Stone, we recognize and address self-defined crises in all of the services that we offer. So in other words, anybody that walks through our doors and what they experience as a crisis, we acknowledge that as well. Just some common symptoms can be physical, such as sleep disturbance, muscle or joint pain, GI issues, appetite, fatigue, clammy hands, feet, any respiratory issues. Shortness of breath is a common one, chest pains, low immunity. For psychological, things such as anxiety, fear, irritability, helplessness, worry, dread, and interpersonal could be increased arguments and conflicts with others, social isolation, job instability, domestic violence, overreactions, etc. So core crisis services are meant to be available to anyone in the community at any given time. Accessibility is key in offering these services, which also includes the venue that would be most appropriate and efficient for the client that's experiencing the crisis. So I just want to take a look at some of those core services and what those look like. So first we have crisis call centers. Typically they're a regional 24/7 clinically staffed hub that can provide crisis intervention through telephone, text, or chat. These type of services need to meet national suicide prevention standards, which that includes the ability to provide risk assessment, engagement of individuals at imminent risk of suicide, and offer coordination of crisis care in real time. So we have a crisis line here at Summit Stone that is 24/7. Second would be walk-in crisis clinics or behavioral health urgent cares. And again, walk-in assessment and intervention is available for any age, insurance, and self-defined crisis at that time. We at Summit Stone have a behavioral health urgent care that operates from 8 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Third would be crisis mobile response teams that are available to reach any person in the service area, whether that's in the home, the workplace, or any community-based location of the individual in crisis. And mobile response teams typically serve a designated county that will respond to calls within those county lines. We also have a mobile response team here at Summit Stone that functions 24/7. And then finally would be crisis stabilization facilities, which provide short-term stays, observation, and crisis stabilization services to all referrals in a home-like living room type setting. So it's a very non-hospital type environment. These facilities typically are run by case managers. They have master's level clinicians on site to provide therapy. There's RNs that are always on site, and usually a med provider, whether that's in person or via telehealth, to offer medication management services for psychiatric care. These stabilization facilities will often have peer staff as well that's available to provide intervention to clients on that unit, which really has been very beneficial, and a lot of evidence shows that having those peer services available with staff having a lived experience, as many of the clients on the unit have had, to provide that connection and intervention as well. So we at Summit Stone also have a crisis stabilization unit. It's a 10-bed, up to 5-day stay here for ages 18 and up. And finally, for just some essential principles for modern crisis care systems, I just put a few on here that are really vital to ensure the success. They need to be sure to address recovery needs, ensure there's a significant role for peers available, provide trauma-informed care, follow either zero suicide or suicide safer care tracks, which is a national strategy for suicide prevention. Offer safety and security for staff and for clients in crisis, and have crisis response partnerships with law enforcement, dispatch, EMS, and a variety of other community partners. I will say that the community partnership are vital for the success of crisis systems. As we all know, it takes a village to provide support and care to promote healthy communities, and we can't do that on our own. So these partnerships are key, and we do a lot of work in collaborating with our partners in Larimer County to provide that care to our clients in our community. So that is my section. I'm going to hand it off to Julie.
Thank you, Sunny. So you've set me up pretty well. My name is Julie Costre, everybody. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I've been working at Crisis for about just shy of 3.5 years. And thank you for having us here. We're really excited to share this information with you all. Talking about a little bit more in depth about qualities of crisis counseling, as Sunny's already referred, crisis counseling is maybe just a little bit different than your traditional forms of maybe outpatient services. It is quicker and brief. We have to kind of just get in and really have that client-centered position with the clients, allowing them to kind of unfold and share what is, in their own words, upsetting to them, to kind of taking their lead. Sometimes we do need to be more active than passive, meaning that we need to ensure that bit on safety and to ensure that they are going to have the correct disposition, and we'll get into levels of care shortly here. It is also collaborative, so it's not necessarily top down, even though maybe it's a little bit more than your standard outpatient treatment. You are also wanting to really work with your client to ensure that they're going to be able to follow through with whatever treatment goals you collaboratively decide on. We're going to increase clients' functioning. We're not going to necessarily work on, personality modifications or maladaptive behavior overtly, building self-esteem. We can just start maybe planting the seed is how I like to think about it. Got a quote at the end. We cannot change the precipitating event, but we can change or alter the client's cognitions and perceptions of the event. offer referrals to supportive agencies, and suggest other coping strategies. So we're really serving a very important bridge for a lot of folks, either who don't have access or maybe have outpatient services and they find themselves in a crisis, which is a universal thing we all at one time or another have experienced. Next slide. In terms of common methods that we use, when I say methods and models, I'm really referring to both the tools and the frame that a crisis clinician would use. When I'm talking about methods, some standard inventories or testing tools, we have things like the patient stress questionnaire. We use that here at Crisis. That is just really talking about symptoms that they're noticing, really addressing depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, trauma responses, and then also just a cursory understanding about any substances that they might use, particularly alcohol, in light of the withdrawal risk that we see with that type of substance. Other tools that we could use include personality tests. We don't specifically use that at Crisis, although we are trained to kind of note different issues when it comes to personality and assessing for strengths or maybe particular triggers having to do with maybe past trauma or how someone's been socialized and maybe the setting that they're in. So that's a second tool that we could use. The client interview, however, is by far the most common that you'll see in crisis counseling. And that's primarily what we focus on when someone would come in for an urgent care walk-in. We're primarily going to focus on that interview with the addition of PSQ, and the BDI is the Beck's depression inventory. So there's different tools you can use along with the interview. So when I say model, that's the frame. We use what's called the 7-stage model of crisis intervention, and that was kind of discovered or developed by Robert. Next slide, please. To go through that, what that really entails is we're going to plan and conduct a thorough biopsychosocial and a crisis assessment. So that's another way of just talking about risks, finding out if there's any risks that that client may have towards dangerous behaviors, relapsing, those types of things. Next, we're going to, when it says make psychological contact, that's just a fancy way of explaining that we're going to start building trust in light of the fact that these people oftentimes have never ever seen me before. So I need to be mindful of that to build and establish that trust and rapport so they can feel like their crisis is going to be addressed in a safe way. Examine and define the dimensions of the problem or crisis. So again, that speaks to folks putting things in their own words so I can hear from them their perception of events. No two situations are alike, and one person might be more intolerable of a job change than another person, or a fight, or there's all kinds of scenarios. So we can't look at that objectively, but we really need to look at subjective factors about how that person is responding to any given stress. Also going to encourage an exploration of feelings and emotions. On the part of the crisis counselor, that's going to involve our active listening and providing encouragement. Encouragement is a really, it seems really simple, but I think oftentimes as crisis clinicians or any clinician that we forget the value of encouragement. And I think in crisis counseling particularly, it really has a lot of value. Also we're going to explore some past positive coping strategies and alternatives, really helping the client get back into the driver's seat, as it were, if their own lives and tools that they have and strengths that they have already in their wheelhouse. We're viewing the client as resourceful and resilient, someone who has potential. That's really critical. Also involves the crisis assessor to be very creative and flexible. So just in the moment, working with that client, not treating everyone the same. Again, the subjective factors is so important in this type of work. Next, we'll implement an action plan, and that's something that's going to be a collaborative effort. We're going to identify supports together. If there's any lacking in referral resources, we're going to provide that to the client, and then the client can demonstrate at least some level that they can go ahead and implement some coping should they be re-triggered, or if this is an ongoing situation, that they have some resources at their disposal. At the conclusion, we'll develop a follow-up plan. So those 7 steps really kind of take you through what we do at Crisis, how we kind of identify what's known as disposition. And disposition is just basically what we end up doing with that client. We're trying to figure out in terms of risks and level of crisis in our assessment. We're going to try to determine, is this person safe to go back home to the supports and resources they have already established or can establish through a phone call and an appointment? Or is this someone that's going to benefit, for example, like Sunny mentioned, like the CSU, the Crisis Stabilization Unit? Or are we going to think about maybe hospitalization? Is this person needing to be placed on a hold? Is this person a voluntary person who is willing and wanting to have some treatment? Those are the kinds of questions that we figure out at that number 7 or 6 and 7 in collaboration with the client. Next slide. So when we talk about holds, there's essentially 4 different types of holds that we're really talking about when we talk about things like involuntary treatment. For purposes of today, I will be really concentrating on the M-1s, and my colleague Rochelle will be reviewing on the ECs, the emergency commitments. But just to kind of give you a quick overview, there are 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, that are out there in the state of Colorado that could be something that you notice or you hear about that might be helpful to know. M1s, or a 2765 or a 72-hour hold, they all mean the same thing. When we talk about 2765, you might ask, well, that seems like random numbers. Why would they put those together? That's really referring to Title 27, Article 65 of the Colorado statutes. As I said, the EC holds, the emergency commitment, those are both drug and alcohol holds, essentially the same process. But like I say, Rochelle will get in further into that. Those are a total of 5 days. The 0.5 or the transportation holds, that's our newest addition to the type of holds that we have at our disposal. Those are not typically used quite as widely as maybe the legislators had hoped when they passed this rule. However, just note quickly that a transportation hold really is when, for example, maybe a law enforcement member is unsure if someone meets criteria for an M1, they can put someone on a 0.5 or a transportation hold, take them to the nearest emergency room or here at the crisis center, and then we as clinicians need to privilege that person over anything else we're doing, including seeing other clients, and go ahead and evaluate that person that the police department would bring in. It's just really in order to kind of ensure safety and then have a quick way to determine whether or not that person needs to be held on an involuntary hold like an M1 or an EC, or discharged back to the community with resources. The other part is short-term certifications. We use the abbreviation STCs or long-term certifications. Those are really a series of M1 holds that someone has been on. Someone maybe, for example, that's chronically mentally ill or does not have access to resources. There's a variety of psychosocial factors why maybe someone would be on a series of M1s, and that can be initiated for a period of 90 days and longer, oftentimes with court-ordered medications. Next slide. So when are M1 holds appropriate? When clients are assessed, back to our 7-step model, as dangerous to the health and safety of themselves or others, or are gravely disabled. And that's taken right directly from the statute, and we'll go and actually examine the definitions in a little bit more detail. Essentially, we are determining risk factors for ability to care for self, and passive versus active suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation. We're considering plans, means, intent, and whether or not they're voluntary or involuntary. Next slide. So who can initiate an M-1 hold? This is very defined in the actual statute. For M1s, it's an intervening professional, such as a member of law enforcement, police officers, sheriffs, deputies, park rangers, interestingly enough. Professional persons, those are designated as, it's a kind of a term of art in the statute. The folks that are licensed to practice medicine, so MDs, DOs, clinical psychologists, and nurse practitioners. We also have the ability as LPCs or LCSWs, LMFTs, and LACs. Essentially a licensed professional in this field. Next slide. All right, so danger to self. We're really going to talk about that the individual poses a substantial risk to the physical harm of self as manifested by recent threats of or attempts at suicide or serious bodily harm to him or herself. So we're thinking about suicidal self-harm or an actual plan, means, and intent to end their life. That's when we're really talking about danger to self. Conversely, danger to others means an individual poses a substantial risk of physical harm to another person or persons, manifested by evidence of recent homicidal or other violent behavior by the person in question, or by evidence that others are placed in reasonable fear of violent behavior and serious physical harm to them, as evidenced by a recent overt act, attempt, or threat to do serious physical harm by the person in question. So we're really talking about two important concepts. We can see that repeatedly they're talking about recent stuff, and as evidenced by. So we really need to be able to substantiate any sort of behaviors that we think that might pose a risk to self or others. Also, when we talk about things like recent, we're really talking about the term imminent, and just cursorily, the term imminent really applies to the proximity and time of dangerousness. More specifically, the term applies to a determination of whether the danger to others or self is current. It's not something that you're applying to how soon in time a specific dangerous act may be undertaken. It's really when, for example, maybe someone that had an anniversary of a divorce or the death of a loved one was key in their mind, and they will say something like, on my grandma's anniversary of her death, she was so important to me. On June 25th, I'm going to end my life. That's really talking about maybe, Julie, you need to examine danger to self a little bit more. Maybe this person needs to be placed on a hold. They're giving me a very specific time in the future when that person wants to end their life. Next slide. The third category we have is gravely disabled, and that's got a three-pronged element of the definition. A condition in which a person, as a result of a mental health disorder, is incapable of making informed decisions about or providing for his or her essential needs without significant supervision and assistance from others. This definition was changed from 2014 in the statute, giving us a little bit more leeway and I think flexibility as clinicians. Before it was a little bit more, just the criteria was more defined, and now it kind of opens it up because no two clients are alike. Gravely disabled is a broad term, but it's also helping us really protect clients that are more vulnerable or experiencing a variety of different psychosocial issues, for us to really step in and give them the care and provide them with that opportunity to get treatment. The second prong, as a result of being incapable of making these informed decisions, a person who is gravely disabled is at risk of substantial bodily harm, dangerous worsening of any concomitant serious physical illness, a significant psychiatric deterioration or mismanagement of her essential needs that could result in substantially bodily harm could occur. And when we're talking about any concomitant serious physical illness, The two kind of examples that I think of off the top of my head would be something like diabetes, someone that has maybe needs to take insulin and is not doing that, and that could pose a serious life-threatening situation. Also something like a seizure disorder where they're not taking medications or haven't seen a neurologist, that could also be something serious. So you're just gonna wanna make sure that when you're doing your crisis assessment, you're really looking at that biopsychosocial and being as thorough as possible to find out if there's any risks involved. The third prong, a person of any age may be gravely disabled, but such term does not include a person whose decision-making capabilities are limited solely by his or her developmental disability. That's really talking about folks that maybe are have IDD, maybe are on the spectrum. Just because of that fact does not necessarily mean in and of itself that I can put that person on a grave disability hold. I think it's really talking about, for example, a lot of these folks have host home families, and a lot of the basic needs are provided in that situation or with their own families, group homes, that kind of scenario. And without that care, so for example, a client who is IDD maybe eloped from that situation, then I might consider and say, hey, Julie, you might want to look at, grave disability. That might be a more appropriate way for me to handle that situation. Next slide. So holds for mental health stabilization. I guess these are really geared to us to start thinking about how this kind of fits in with the larger picture of mental health, public policy, how this kind of fits into the overarching current climate that we're now as a nation really kind of talking and addressing. So psychiatric holds, they permit involuntary admission to a healthcare facility of a person with an acute mental illness under certain circumstances. We've already kind of outlined what those circumstances might be. Emergency holds potentially play an important role as a bridge between people in crisis and emergency mental health services that individuals may not otherwise have been willing or able to access. I think that that's a really important point. We'll kind of get into it as we go. Over the past 30 years, this pathway has coexisted with a range of new approaches to the management of people with mental illness, including the proliferation of police-based crisis intervention models and other forms of jail diversion. And Sunny kind of talked about some of the other programs that crisis services offers, including things like we have jail-based services. We had actually a very informative presentation today where we learned a lot more about some of the forensic work that Summit Stone is doing in the community with a lot of our community partners. We also have the co-responder program where they have that mental health professional embedded in law enforcement, as well as our very own mobile team that can kind of serve as that appropriate bridge. Next slide. So why is this important? I'm going to give you some stats here. Serious health and social problems exist, clearly, reflected in those in crisis and the portals of local mental health services. This is exacerbated by the undertreatment of mental illness. In the US, about 40% of people with a severe mental illness are left untreated, which is a pretty staggering figure if you think about it. People with severe mental illness who do not receive treatment are the most likely to end up in an acute mental health crisis in need of emergency hospitalization. Individuals facing a mental health crisis who do not receive treatment may go without care, or in the case of violent or disruptive behavior, are often arrested. And that is a very undesirable outcome. In theory, emergency holds reduce harm, increase treatment access, and influence community safety, but they also highlight chronic deficiencies and treatment capacity. So we're really thinking about the importance from an advocacy and social justice standpoint, hopefully moving our society increasingly towards preventative care in mental health and not punitive measures. Next slide. In terms of the complexity of this system, optimal use of involuntary hold laws involve the balance of competing concerns. We're talking about the welfare of adults with incapacitating mental health conditions, the civil rights of such adults, the public's concern with safety, high direct cost of acute inpatient psychiatric services. And that's where crisis really actually serves a very important role. People can stay here at our CSU. That's a lower level of care than an inpatient psychiatric service. And perhaps even higher indirect deferred cost of not providing such services in a timely way to the people who need them. So as Sunny mentioned, it really does take a village. This is a public policy matter that really impacts all of us. The public, as well as these different subdivisions or disciplines, folks in behavioral health like myself, also law enforcement clearly, as we see in recent events, and the judicial system, civil courts, and the criminal justice system. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rochelle.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So in reviewing our emergency commitments or EC holds, as Julie was mentioning, this is really the substance use version of the mental health hold. And it's helpful to use this in cases when people are under the influence of a substance, because we don't really know ultimately how much the substance is impacting their thinking and whether they would be at risk to themselves or others if they were not under the influence of the substance. So we use these holds when a person is under the influence of or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol and is clearly dangerous to the health and safety of him or herself or others. So what does that mean? Under the influence is any person whose mental or physical functioning is temporarily but substantially impaired as a result of the presence of drugs in his or her body. Incapacitated, any person who is unconscious or has judgment so impaired that they're incapable of making a rational decision with respect to the need for treatment, and or any person who is incapable to take care of basic personal needs or safety or lacks sufficient understanding or capacity to make or communicate rational decisions concerning him or herself. And so an example of this would be if someone was so intoxicated on alcohol that they were kind of drifting in and out of consciousness and really weren't able to make rational decisions and communicate those about their need for treatment. Next slide, please. So we already talked about when they're appropriate, who can initiate them, the law enforcement officer, physician, spouse, guardian, or relative of the person to be committed, or any other adult responsible person who has actually observed the behavior of the individual. So with this, unlike the mental health hold, we do have more flexibility in who is able to get these people into treatment as needed, which is a unique factor about this kind of hold. Next slide, please. So there are two actual forms for the emergency commitment. It refers to both the alcohol hold and a drug hold. So there are two separate if you're going to fill them out. We often run into situations where someone is both intoxicated by alcohol and under the influence of drugs. And in those cases, drugs trump, meaning we use the drug application form. Obviously, if it's a situation where someone's intoxicated on alcohol, they're positive for marijuana, they'll use your best clinical judgment, but generally, in most cases, drugs trump. Next slide, please. So when an EC is approved, so that person will be committed, evaluated, and treated for a maximum of 5 days. So it's longer than the mental health hold. And generally in 5 days, that's about how long we need to get a substance out of someone's body and past the most significant withdrawal risk. So it gives us a little bit more leeway. And when someone's placed on an EC, they will go to either social detox or medical detox. They can go directly to there, or sometimes they need to make a stop at the emergency department on the way to get medical clearance or treatment at that point. So when the administrator determines that the grounds for commitment no longer exist, and that can be either that we've run to the end of the 5 days and it's expiring, or because they're being constantly monitored and evaluated, whoever the provider at the facility is decides that they're going to terminate the EC a little bit early for whatever reason. So at that point, that person will then become voluntary and encouraged to seek further voluntary treatment. It is also possible, we've seen that the risk is still there in terms of their risk to themselves or others. And at the end of the EC, they are then placed on a mental health hold to get mental health treatment. So there is some flexibility. Once we get this substance out of their system, they can still get some mental health treatment for that. No person on an EC shall be detained in a treatment facility for more than 5 days. The only exception is if they are placed on an involuntary commitment, which is the long-term version of the EC. So it's a helpful tool that we have. Next slide, please. So moving to levels of care. In terms of inpatient treatment, we'll talk about the 3 levels of inpatient treatment. So I know there's a lot of confusion around that. So inpatient or full psychiatric hospitalization is the highest level of care, followed by acute treatment unit and then crisis stabilization unit. So the inpatient generally is if there's a risk to harm of self or others that's ongoing, really they need constant monitoring to keep themselves safe. It could be a high flight risk, grave disability is imminent, or they're floridly psychotic, they can't meet their own activities of daily living, not really oriented to person, place, time, situation, usually significant medical needs or withdrawal risks or potential for seclusion. So an example of someone who would be appropriate for the inpatient level of care would be, let's say, someone who very highly psychotic, don't know where they are or why they're there. And maybe there's a very recent incident of aggression. That person would be most appropriate to be at that inpatient level of treatment. For the acute treatment unit or ATU, this is kind of our middle range level of care. So there still can be risks to harming self or others, and they need some monitoring, but can generally keep themselves pretty safe on the unit. And they're not experiencing significant substance withdrawal symptoms. They're generally engaged, willing to be there, not requiring significant seclusion or restraint, sometimes a bit of a flight risk, not too bad. So someone who would be appropriate for this level of care might be someone who is on a mental health hold. They've maybe attempted to kill themselves, not really any medical issues, maybe a little bit agitated about being in treatment, but are generally redirectable and not any violence risk. And then on the next slide, we have our crisis stabilization unit or CSU, and that's one of the level of care that we have here at our facility. And so in our CSU level of care, people can be admitted voluntarily or on a mental health hold. There can still be medium to moderate risk of harming self to others, but generally, with the exception of the 15-minute checks that are provided, they can keep themselves safe on the unit. Sometimes they're in need of medication adjustment, monitoring, or more than one psychiatric evaluation or appointment. They need a little bit higher level of care than that. There can be a recent history of non-adherence to meds, poor insight or compliance. They can still be experiencing some psychosis. So an example of someone at a CSU level of care would be someone who's maybe been having some pretty serious suicidal thoughts. They can still be engaged in treatment, but maybe it's not working so well and that things are getting worse and worse for them, and they're willing to be here and want to be here to be stabilized. So the next slide, for social detox and respite care. So these are 24-hour facilities, but they're not considered to be inpatient levels of treatment. So the social detox would be appropriate for people needing 24-hour support withdrawing from alcohol, stimulants, or other substances, and there's some significant functional impairment. I won't go into all the exceptions, but generally for a social detox level of care, if people are withdrawing from benzodiazepines, barbiturates, sometimes opiates, or alcohol, depending on the withdrawal risk. Historically, they might not be appropriate for that level of care and may need to go to the emergency department or a medical detox facility. Respite, it's a really helpful level of care. This is for individuals, they can still be experiencing a behavioral health crisis, but generally they're at low risk of harm to themselves or others and can keep themselves safe generally. They need to be able to articulate and formulate goals for their stay in respite, and to be able to say, I'm doing X, Y, and Z toward meeting these goals. They're able to administer their own meds, they can meet their own ADLs, but they're just needing some support, maybe in navigating that crisis with housing or a safe place to stay while they're getting engaged in treatment. And this level of care is generally quite short term. I think no more than 2 weeks is, in my experience, the longest that people are able to stay in respite care. Next slide, please. So for outpatient, this can be intensive outpatient or individual therapy, group therapy. People can still be experiencing a behavioral disturbance. I know the slide says low risk of danger. Really, people can be low, medium, or high risk of danger to themselves or others, but certainly needing to have some safety in place, whatever safety measures those are, and are still able to maintain in the community. And we are part of a zero suicide initiative, and that could be its own presentation, so I won't go into it too much. But we can provide some extra support and care for the higher level or higher risk individuals who are maintaining their safety in the community. And just wanted to mention the state hospital. That's not really an accessible level of care for us here at Crisis or from the hospital. That's kind of a level of care all to its own. But it's a forensic hospital that serves individuals with pending criminal charges who require competency evaluations. They've been found by a court to be incompetent to proceed, or individuals found to be guilty by reason of insanity. And that is at the Pueblo location. Next slide, please. So in just summarizing what Crisis is and what it looks like when people come in, first, we're engaging and initiating contact with them. We're meeting with them generally about an hour. And so it's very quick. We have to build rapport and trust and show empathy, really understanding why are they here? What are they hoping to get out of being here? We're then problem exploration, defining the crisis. So we're not getting into the weeds of, the whole mental health history, though sometimes that can be helpful, but generally we're focusing on just what's going on right now. What is the current crisis? We're not doing any ongoing therapy and just figuring out how can we help you today. Providing support, provide all different kinds of support, whether that's trying to build up people's support systems, giving them resources, certainly still using therapeutic interventions that just for in the moment crises, and certainly assessing for safety throughout the whole assessment. And examining alternative solutions. When we're in crisis mode, we're not thinking rationally or clearly. So helping them to look at what are some other options, whether that's coping skills or some different thinking patterns that might be a little bit more helpful to navigate the crisis in the future. Planning to reestablish control. So generally speaking, anyone who leaves our crisis center to return to the community is leaving with a safety plan. And that safety plan outlines how do I identify that I'm getting in a crisis mode, what are coping skills, who can I reach out to for some support, so that we're getting them back on track, and then sending them back out into the community with resources and a plan for them to be able to prevent themselves, hopefully, from getting into crisis mode again. Obtaining commitment, this is really done throughout the assessment, is really trying to get information from that person about how committed they are to changing things, whether that's short-term, long-term, and to keeping themselves and others safe. And then we're certainly planning throughout about what are our options based on that. And lastly, follow-up. Here at our crisis center, we do a 24-hour follow-up call. And we're really checking in with people about have they been able to keep themselves out of crisis mode, use the coping skills that we've given them on their safety plan. We're not checking in on have you started working through your long-term trauma with your therapist, or making huge personality changes. We're really just focusing on the crisis and what we addressed during the session. And so at that, I will turn it back over to Sunny.
Thank you, Rochelle and Julie. So just quickly in conclusion, crisis services really, like I mentioned before, are designed successfully, need to be designed to serve anyone, anywhere, at any time in a given community to be successful. So with that approach and dedicating the resources and needs to decrease, more ED visits, psychiatric needs in the hospital, and reduce demands on the justice system as well. So better care and better health outcomes equals lower cost to the community as well. So we timed that pretty well. I think we have 5 minutes left. So we do have a reference slide, and then I wanted to put our services up, our crisis services there, but now I'd like to open it up to questions.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. That was amazing. And I do have a couple questions. And while we're going through those, I will open it up to anybody else who has any questions for these three ladies. So the first one was, what about when you don't have cooperation from the client due to their cognitive status? And this came pretty early on in the presentation.
Can you say that one more time? If we're not aware of their cognitive functioning, what to do?
What happens if you don't have cooperation from the client due to their cognitive status?
Well, in those types of scenarios, it's usually someone that will have some sort of collateral information from, whether they're being brought in by police due to some sort of issue, not necessarily something criminal, but maybe they were, wandering around somewhere and like at a store, and like an employee notified the police to say, hey, this person seems to be confused. Other times a therapist might bring in their patient or a family member. So we really try to bridge and have that collateral piece. So we're not just working in solo. Because like I said, oftentimes these are people that I've never met before. So I don't know baseline functioning. I don't know the ins and outs of their world. So I just really try to work with those collaterals that I can, and working with that patient about who they already have hooked up with in terms of some sort of support or resources or care, and then take it from there.
Right on. Perfect. So there was another question. Are the holds that you referred to Colorado specific, or are they on a national level?
Great question. So holds are pretty much functioning in all of our 50 states. However, the ones that we talked about today were specific in terms of the language and the ins and outs, like who can do them, how long, these different terms of arts like imminency and stuff. That's really tailored to here in Colorado. But all 50 states have something along those lines.
Okay, all right. And the last one I have right here is for the 0.5 holds, the greatest barrier they're running into is police departments not wanting to take the time out of their day to transport someone. How do you address this with police departments and stress the important impact these holds can have?
Another great question. All of these community partnerships, it's not going to do anyone any service to maybe get off on the wrong foot, although there are some very real frustrations, as the question really keenly denotes. I would say just like education is a big part, and even if they can't do a transportation hold, law enforcement is more than able to do other types of holds. And so just community collaboration, us checking in and ensuring that they know us and we know them is really that. I think that really serves a greater purpose for that specific case and just our working relationship in general. Just it really, like I said, it takes a village, and it's all these different disciplines and professions working together to ensure safety and to ensure people get care and treatment that really so desperately need it, based on some of those stats that we reviewed today.
Wow. Yeah. Great points. Ladies, thank you so much. Real quick to everybody listening, if you happen to have called in on a phone number versus using your email to log into the webinar, please send me that information. Otherwise, I can't get you a certificate because the phone number has no name associated. And I want to make sure everybody gets their certificate. Again, these are recorded. You'll find them on our website. Sunny, Julie, and Rochelle, I can't thank you enough. This was a great webinar. And we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share with us. So again, on behalf of Harmony Foundation, thank you everyone for participating, and stay tuned for next month's webinar. It will be regarding veterans, and more specifics will be released as I have them, but it'll be a great webinar as well. Everybody have a wonderful day. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.